sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
All right, so get ready for this deep dive because today's topic is, well, it's a real head scratcher.
Yeah.
We're talking about former President Trump, the Gaza Strip, and a proposal he made that's so out there that it's gotten reactions from pretty much everywhere.
It's definitely a fascinating situation, especially considering the timing, you know?
Right.
This comes at a time when Israel and Hamas are barely holding on to a ceasefire after that war that, led to such a tragic loss of life.
Yeah, the situation's already super tense, and then this gets thrown into the mix.
And it's like...
We've got this article here from the Associated Press that lays out the global response. And to be honest, some of the pushback is coming from some pretty unexpected places.
Absolutely. And to really grasp how significant these reactions are, I think we need to break down exactly what Trump is proposing.
Okay, so let's do that. He's talking about the U.S. taking control of the Gaza Strip, right?
Right. And he uses some pretty strong language, too. Take over. Own it. The idea is that the U.S. would become responsible for the territory, resettle the Palestinian population somewhere else, and redevelop the whole area.
Hold on, resettle the entire Palestinian population. Where would they even go?
That's a great question. And that's actually just one of the many unanswered questions that this proposal brings up.
I bet.
And it gets even more interesting when you hear what Trump's vision for Gaza's future is. He wants to turn it into the Rivi era of the Middle East.
It's kind of giving me Trump Tower on the Mediterranean vibes.
Yeah, there's definitely a pattern here. If you look back at some of Trump's past statements, like remember when he wanted to buy Greenland?
Oh, yeah.
Or what about those suggestions about annexing Canada or taking control of the Panama Canal?
Yeah, it's kind of like a familiar playbook.
Yeah.
Big, bold ideas that make headlines but don't really have much to do with reality. But let's get back to Gaza. Is anyone actually taking this proposal seriously?
Well, that's where things get interesting. The AP article points out just how much opposition this idea is facing. And it's not just from countries that are typically at odds with the U.S.
Oh, really?
We're talking close allies like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, even Australia and Ireland.
So not exactly the usual suspects then?
No, it's a pretty diverse group, which makes the pushback even more significant. Like Saudi Arabia put out a statement rejecting any actions that infringe upon the Palestinian people's rights and reaffirmed their support for an independent Palestinian state.
Okay, so that's a pretty clear no from one of the big players in the region. What about other reactions? Anything really stand out to you?
Well, there were quite a few, but one that grabbed my attention was the statement from Turkey's foreign minister.
What'd they say?
He called the proposal wrong and absurd.
Wow.
Which really shows just how much concern there is within the region. You have to remember, Turkey has historically been a defender of Palestinian rights, so their reaction isn't really surprising.
It sounds like this is way more than just a diplomatic disagreement. This is hitting a nerve internationally.
Definitely. The idea of uprooting a whole population, especially in a region as volatile as that one, has really set off alarm bells regardless of the stated intentions.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the global community is basically saying, thanks, but no thanks. What about the Palestinians themselves? I can't imagine they're thrilled about this.
You're right about that. Their response has been strong, as you might expect. President Mahmoud Abbas is calling on the UN for protection and arguing that this proposal completely disregards international law.
That's a bold move to basically call out a former superpower on the world stage.
It is. And then there's Hamas, the group that controls Gaza. They're accusing Trump of taking Israel's side and ignoring what they call genocide and displacement.
So we've got condemnation from both Palestinian leadership and Hamas. It's clear they see this as a direct threat.
Exactly. It really underscores that any attempt to find a solution in Gaza has to take into account what the Palestinians themselves want and how they see things. It can't just be a top-down approach.
That makes sense. Which brings us back to the U.S. What's the political climate like back home regarding this proposal?
Well, the U.S. political scene is, how do I put this, divided these days. So there's some strong opinions coming from both sides. Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat, he didn't hold back. He called Trump's comments offensive, insane, dangerous, and foolish.
He really went for it, huh?
No mincing words there. And he went on to suggest that these kinds of proposals could actually hurt America's credibility internationally, making other countries see them as an unreliable partner.
That's a serious accusation. You're basically saying this could affect how other countries view the U.S. as a whole.
Right. It touches on this idea of soft power, which is the ability to influence others through persuasion and diplomacy instead of force. When actions like this raise concerns about a country's reliability and commitment to international norms, it can really damage that soft power and make it much harder to achieve foreign policy goals.
It's not just about looking bad. It could have real consequences for the U.S. on a global scale.
Exactly. And then on the other side of the aisle, you have Representative Rashida Tlaib, who's a Democrat and Palestinian American. She's accusing Trump of advocating for ethnic cleansing with this resettlement idea, which is obviously a very loaded term with a lot of historical baggage.
Wow, that escalates things pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It sounds like this proposal has just ignited a firestorm of debate.
It really has. And what's particularly interesting is that this isn't happening in isolation. It comes at a time when the Trump administration has been taking steps to dismantle USAID.
USA.
Yeah, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which has been a key player in global humanitarian aid.
Wait, so on one hand, you have this proposal to take over and redevelop Gaza, and on the other hand, you're pulling back from international aid. That seems like a mixed message, doesn't it?
It definitely raises questions. If the U.S. is stepping back from its role as a provider of aid, what exactly does this takeover of Gaza even entail?
Okay, I'm already feeling like I need a whiteboard to keep track of all of this.
Yeah.
Before we go any further, let's do a quick recap of what we've learned so far. So we're talking about a proposal from former President Trump to basically annex and redevelop the Gaza Strip. This has been met with a ton of international condemnation, including from key U.S. allies. Both the Palestinian leadership and Hamas have rejected it, and the U.S. political scene is totally in an uproar over it.
You got it. Now the question is, where do we go from here? What does this all mean for the future of Gaza and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Now that, my friend, is exactly where we'll pick up in part 2 of this deep dive. Okay, I'm still trying to process everything we just talked about. It's like someone just threw a grenade into an already volatile situation.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And what I find really interesting is how different Trump's approach is from what everyone else thinks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
You're talking about the two-state solution, right? The idea of having Israel and an independent Palestine existing peacefully together.
Exactly. That's been the main framework for decades, but honestly, it hasn't really worked out, has it?
Well, yeah. The two-state solution has run into roadblock after roadblock. You've got the issue of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, the whole question of Jerusalem's status, ongoing security concerns, and deep political divisions on both sides. It's just super complicated.
It really is. And those complexities make it so hard to find common ground, which leads us back to Trump's proposal. Do you think maybe this is his way of trying to break the deadlock, to offer some kind of radical alternative?
It's almost like he's trying to apply a real estate mogul's way of thinking to international diplomacy. You know, like, everything's negotiable, let's make a deal.
I see what you mean. There's definitely that deal-making attitude. But we have to remember that this kind of unilateral action, without everyone involved agreeing to it, is very unusual in international relations.
And as we've seen, it's caused a lot of pushback. But just for a minute, let's try to see things from the other side. What could be the argument in favor of such a drastic approach?
Well, one could argue that the two-state solution, at least how it's been done so far, hasn't worked. Trump might point to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, all the poverty and lack of opportunity, as his justification for doing something more forceful.
And what about this whole Riviera of the Middle East
Yeah.
idea? Is that just a kitschy phrase, or is there actually some economic potential there?
It's true that geographically Gaza has some things going for it. It's right on the Mediterranean coast and has a relatively young population. But to unlock that potential, you'd need massive investment, a stable political situation, and most importantly, a solution to the conflict itself.
Those are some pretty big hurdles, to say the least. And we can't forget about the massive challenge of moving millions of Palestinians. Where would they even go? Who would accept them?
That's a crucial question that this proposal just doesn't address. You can't just erase an entire population from a territory without considering the huge human cost and the potential for even more instability in the future.
This whole plan seems to bring up more questions than it answers.
I think that's a fair assessment, and that's exactly why there's so much skepticism and concern around it.
Okay, so let's get to the heart of the matter. What does this mean for Gaza's future? Is Trump's proposal a realistic way forward? Or is it just a distraction that's taking attention away from finding a real solution?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's very unlikely that this specific plan will ever actually happen. The international opposition is too strong, and the logistical challenges are just too big. But the interesting thing is that this proposal, just by being so bold, could actually change the conversation. It forces everyone to rethink their assumptions and consider new possibilities, even if they're totally different from what we've been talking about before.
So you're saying it's less about the plan itself and more about its potential to shake things up to make people think differently.
Exactly. It's like throwing a wrench into the gears of a machine. It might not fix the machine, but it definitely makes you stop and look at how everything works.
I like that analogy. Okay, let me put on my speculation hat for a second. If you had to guess, what do you think Trump's real intentions are here? Is he actually serious about this plan, or is it more of a negotiating tactic, a way to pressure people?
Well, Trump has a reputation for being unconventional, for breaking the rules and traditions. It's possible that he really thinks this is a solution, that he sees himself as the ultimate deal maker who can do what others haven't been able to do.
He does love to present himself as the ultimate disruptor.
Right. But on the other hand, it's also possible that this is all strategic, a way to push his own agenda or the agendas of his allies. Maybe he's using this proposal to see how people react, to get a sense of things, and to create leverage in future negotiations. It's like he's playing 4D chess on the world stage.
So he's either a visionary leader or a master manipulator.
It's hard to say for sure. And that's what makes this so interesting. We're dealing with a tangled web of motivations, power dynamics, and historical grievances. It's like a real-life political thriller happening right now.
It kind of makes you wonder if anyone really knows what he's thinking.
Maybe that's the point. The uncertainty itself can be a powerful tool.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this goes beyond just a policy proposal. It's about sending a message, creating chaos, and potentially changing the whole power structure in the region.
You've got it. And that's why it's so important to look not just at the proposal itself, but also at the motivations behind it and the potential consequences, both the ones that are intended and the ones that aren't. We need to look at the bigger picture.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where you don't even know what the picture is supposed to look like.
Yeah.
All right, I need a minute to think about all this. What are your initial thoughts? What are the biggest takeaways for you so far?
What really stands out to me is the power of words and how much of an impact they can have, especially when they're spoken by someone in a position of authority. Even if this specific plan never happens, the fact that it's been said that it's out there in the world can shape how people see things and influence what they do in the future.
You're right, words have a way of doing that. Sometimes it's not about whether an idea is practical, but the message it sends, the intentions. It shows the reactions it causes.
Exactly. And in this case, those reactions and those consequences could be pretty big.
All right, I have to admit I'm totally hooked. This is way more complicated than I thought. I'm really interested in digging deeper into Trump's motivations and what this all means for any future peace talks.
Me too. And in part 3, we'll explore the broader implications of this proposal, both for the Middle East and for the United States' place in the world.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick break and then come back for the final part of this deep dive. Okay, we're back and ready to jump into the final part of this whole thing. I'm still trying to wrap my head around just how bold Trump's proposal is. It's not every day you hear a former U.S. president casually suggesting that the U.S. should just take over another territory.
Yeah, it's definitely not your typical diplomacy. But that's what makes this situation so interesting. It forces us to think about some really big questions about power and sovereignty and what America's role in the world actually is.
Okay, so let's talk about those deeper implications. What are the potential consequences of this proposal, even if it never actually happens?
Well, one thing is that it's definitely made an already tense situation even worse. All the strong reactions we've seen from the international community, from Palestinian leaders, and even within the U.S., it shows how deep the divisions and mistrust really are.
So it's like pouring gasoline on a fire that's already burning.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it makes the already difficult task of finding a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict even harder.
We talked earlier about how some U.S. politicians are worried that this whole thing could hurt America's credibility and make them seem like an unreliable partner. Yeah. Is that a real concern?
Absolutely. The U.S. has always presented itself as a champion of democracy and human rights, a mediator in international disputes. But this proposal, with its unilateral approach and its seeming disregard for international law, could really damage that image. It could make other countries think twice about trusting or working with the U.S.
So it's not just about looking bad. It could actually affect America's ability to influence other countries.
Exactly. It goes back to that concept of soft power, which is the ability to persuade and build relationships instead of just relying on military force or economic pressure. When you start raising doubts about whether a country is reliable and whether it's going to play by the rules, you risk losing that soft power.
And that loss of influence can have a domino effect.
Yeah.
It could make it harder to negotiate trade deals, to form alliances, or to be a leader in international organizations.
Right. It's all connected.
Okay, then there's the whole question of precedent. If the U.S. just goes around taking over territories like this, what message does that send to other countries?
That's a really important point. It's almost like saying that whoever is stronger gets to decide what's right, and that could lead to a very dangerous world. It could encourage other powerful countries to do the same thing, which could throw the whole system of international relations into chaos.
So the effects of this proposal could be huge, even if the plan itself never gets off the ground.
Exactly. And that's why we need to look not just at the specifics of what's being proposed, but also at why it's being proposed and what the consequences might be, both the ones that are intended and the ones that aren't. We need to see the bigger picture.
Okay, let's talk about the timing of this whole thing for a minute. It comes right after a devastating war in Gaza, a war that killed thousands of people and caused a lot of destruction. Do you think that timing matters?
It's impossible to ignore that context. Putting forward this proposal right after so much suffering is going to make people question the intentions behind it.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if this is really about helping the Palestinian people or if there's something else going on. Some might see it as trying to take advantage of a bad situation, using the chaos and desperation to get something.
That's definitely a perception that could create more resentment and instability in the region.
So even if this proposal is meant well, the timing makes it hard to see it as anything other than taking advantage of the situation.
That's true. And it shows how important it is to be sensitive and aware when dealing with such a complex and emotionally charged issue.
All right, so we've talked about the international implications, the damage to the U.S.'s reputation, the impact on the peace process, and the questionable timing. But let's talk about the people who would be most affected. What about the Palestinians themselves? How would this proposal actually affect their lives?
Well, at the most basic level, it would mean they'd be forced to leave their homes, their communities, their land. And as we've talked about, we don't know where they would go or who would accept them.
It's hard to imagine the disruption, the trauma, the loss of identity and connection that comes with that kind of forced displacement.
It would be incredibly devastating. And we can't forget that this wouldn't be the first time Palestinians have been forced from their homes. The trauma of the Nakba, which was when a huge number of Palestinians were displaced during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, still affects the region today.
So this proposal could reopen old wounds and bring back those historical grievances.
It's definitely possible, and that could easily lead to more extremism and violence, making peace even harder to achieve.
It's like a never-ending cycle. Violence leads to more violence, displacement leads to more displacement. And this proposal, if it happened, seems like it would just keep that cycle going.
It does raise serious concerns about whether this is truly about helping Palestinians or if it's about something else, agendas that might not have their best interests in mind.
What kind of agendas are we talking about?
Well, some critics say that this proposal is actually more about making Israel stronger, about solidifying its control over disputed territories. They see it as a way to completely eliminate the possibility of a Palestinian state, to make the two-state solution impossible.
So it's about changing the map, about making the current situation permanent, but in a way that benefits Israel and hurts the Palestinians.
That's what a lot of people are saying. And it's a view that many in the international community share, which is why there's so much opposition to this proposal.
Okay, let's take a step back and try to understand all of this.
Sure.
We've got this controversial proposal from a former U.S. president, a complex history, a lot of competing interests, and a ton of unanswered questions. What does it all mean? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there are no simple solutions to this conflict. Any way forward is going to require tough choices, compromises from everyone, and a willingness to see things from different perspectives. There's no magic solution.
And this proposal, with its unilateral approach, its disregard for what the rest of the world thinks, and its potential to make things worse and cause more suffering, doesn't seem like it's helping us get to that kind of solution, does it?
It definitely raises a lot of concerns, both about whether it could actually work and about whether it's ethical. And it reminds us that even in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable, actions have consequences. Those consequences can spread out and affect millions of people.
So what's next? Does this proposal just disappear, or does it have the power to change how we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
It's hard to say for sure what the long-term impact will be, but one thing's for sure, this has created a lot of uncertainty in an already unstable situation. And it's forced us to ask some really important questions about power, about justice, and about what America's role in the world should be.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today. We explored a controversial proposal, its global impact, and the complex reality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's clear that there's no easy fix, and that any solution will require careful consideration and collaboration. What are your thoughts on all of this? How do you think the international community should approach this issue? Let us know in the comments. We always appreciate hearing from you. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till